Hong Kong, where authorities have detained several people as they attempted to block any public commemoration of the 33rd anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown. China is vying to remove all reminders of the deadly event that took place in 1989. Reports say at least half a dozen people were taken away by the police, including activist Yu Pan from the League of Social Democrats Party. The activist was later released without a charge. Another activist, Lau Shanqing, was however arrested for wearing a T-shirt that read, and I quote, "Mourn June 4th." Authorities had earlier warned citizens that participating in any unauthorized assembly on June 4th risked the maximum penalty of 5 years of imprisonment. Discussions, especially at public forums of June 4th, 1989, when China set troops in tanks of peaceful protesters, is all but forbidden in the mainland. And in the semi-autonomous Hong Kong, large-scale remembrance was dismissed after Beijing imposed the draconian national security law to snuff out dissent. Before 2019, Hong Kong's Victoria Park had seen yearly vigils and large-scale remembrance events. Large parts of Victoria Park remained shut, and the adjacent Causeway Bay had a heavy police presence with multiple people targeted for searches. Some activists lit candles in private to mark the 33rd anniversary of the crackdown.
去維園度悼念啊，或者去其他地方嘅悼念，其實只不過係形式嚟嘅。最緊要嘅係我哋呢個民主運動嘅主體係每一個嘅香港人，只要呢班香港人冇放棄過自己嘅未來，冇放棄過自己嘅希望，咁其實呢個香港仍然有希望。
While Hong Kongers couldn't, hundreds in Taipei gathered to commemorate the bloody crackdown on pro-democracy protesters. Activists in Taipei assembled a new version of the Pillar of Shame, a statue commemorating the Tiananmen protesters that a leading Hong Kong university removed in December from its campus. Where it had stood for over 2 decades, shouts in support of Hong Kong rang out after the statue was put up.
甚至更恐怖、更残忍的手法，甚至比我念大学的时候，王丹念大学的时候，当时
那么多学生、那么公民来到。
I think it's really nice that we get to do this in Taiwan, because now that Hong Kong is banned, they cannot go to the Victoria Park to commemorate this event anymore. And so it is a responsibility for us Hong Kongers to continue to spread the awareness of this June 4th movement.
So let's now tell you in detail what exactly happened 33 years ago. Young protesters in China had gathered at the Tiananmen Square in Beijing. They were demanding greater freedom and individual rights. But the Chinese government chose to respond by sending troops and tanks on its own people. Thousands were killed and injured in what came to be known as the Tiananmen massacre. Our next report tells you the story of that fateful day.
A lone man confronting Chinese tanks became the defining image of China's Tiananmen Square protests. On June 4, 1989, the Tiananmen Square and its neighborhood in Beijing saw the massacre of 2,000 to 3,000 people at the hands of Chinese government. The death of Hu Yaobang on 15 April 1989 set the stage for mass demonstrations. Hu, a former communist leader, had worked hard for democratic reforms in China. The protests that lasted for few weeks saw thousands of protesters, mostly university students, demanding democracy, personal freedom and probe into corruption by ministers and top communist officials. The protests became China's greatest political upheaval since the end of the Cultural Revolution more than a decade earlier. The initial response of the government was to issue stern warnings to the protesters, and it took no action against the mounting crowds. The media coverage of the event was increasing. as a large number of Western journalists had gathered in Beijing to report on the incident. During the last 2 weeks of May, martial law was declared in Beijing and army troops were stationed around the city. However, any attempt by the troops to reach the Tiananmen Square was thwarted when the citizens flooded the streets and blocked their way. But by the beginning of June, the government, fearing anarchy, decided to crush the protests with a heavy hand. On the night of June 3rd and 4th, the People's Liberation Army's tanks and heavily armed troops advanced towards the Tiananmen Square. The soldiers opened fire at the protesters. The tanks mowed down the protesters who tried to block their way. Though the government never released the death toll of the crackdown, it is estimated that over 2,000 people were killed. Those who survived were arrested. Many of them received prison sentences of varying lengths of time. A lot of them were executed. The Chinese government denounced the demonstrations as a counter-revolutionary movement, and the flurry of arrests and executions frightened many demonstrators into silence. But the world that saw the horror of the Chinese government's act did not keep quiet. China faced global condemnation for the murder of innocent people. But the events of that day were quickly forgotten. There is nothing in the vast square to remind anybody of what happened here. Not a monument, a statue, or even a tiny plaque. The Chinese government never expressed regret over the killings and rejected all calls for an investigation. The protests, first labeled as counter-revolutionary riot, are now merely referred as political turmoil, if there are any references to it. In the years since the incident, the government has suppressed any references to the event. Public commemoration of the event is officially banned. It appears as though the events of June 4, 1989 have been erased from the Chinese history. Bureau Report, WION World is One.